Actually, this isn't entirely true. I kind of screwed the recipe up, but I'll explain later. Let me just fix the title. There we go, that's better. So if you want to consult the original written recipe that I used to make this bread, it's in the description, and I do suggest you follow the exact ingredient amounts on this one, since this is a bread recipe. I start this recipe by blooming my yeast. To do this, you want to take your water and milk, mix them together, and heat them to about 90 degrees. Then add in your packet of dry active yeast, and let it sit for about 10 minutes. Oh, and don't forget to add your sugar in as well. If you've never bloomed your yeast before, all this process does is bring your yeast to life. This allows the bread to rise more consistently, and also lets you know if there's anything wrong with the yeast that you're using. A properly bloomed yeast should have bubbles arising at the top of the liquid. This is a sign that the yeast is alive and well. Once you've bloomed your yeast, go ahead and add the yeast mixture along with the rest of your ingredients into the bowl of a stand mixer and mix on medium-low speed until the dough pulls away from the sides of the bowl and forms a cohesive ball. This should take about 8 to 10 minutes. If your dough looks a little sticky and is having trouble pulling away from the sides, feel free to add all-purpose flour 1 tablespoon at a time to help hydrate the dough. Once your dough has finished kneading, transfer the whole affair into a well-oiled bowl and cover with some plastic wrap. Then place the dough in a warm place to proof for 1 to 2 hours until doubled in size. So this is where my first mistake came in. Because I didn't have the correct loaf pan for this recipe, I decided to go with a slightly bigger loaf pan, and I thought I could overproof my dough so it would fit the loaf pan and I would get a similarly sized, more airy dough, but obviously that's not what happened. You'll see how this came back to bite me later. So once you've proofed your dough, you want to knock out all its air and turn it out onto a well-floured work surface. Roll the dough so it fits the size of your loaf pan, making a seam on the top. Then picking the seam up with your hands, flip the dough so it's seam side down in the loaf pan. Now I suggest you use the loaf pan that is recommended by the recipe. However, if you're using the loaf pan that I did, I suggest you proof it the same amount as the recipe says. You will just get a flatter loaf, but in terms of taste and texture, it should be the same. Cover your loaf pan with oiled plastic wrap and put it into a warm place to proof again for 30 to 40 minutes. After your bread has risen, preheat your oven to 350 degrees. If you're using a properly sized loaf pan, your bread should have risen just barely above the edges of the pan. If you're using my size loaf pan, then your bread should have barely risen to the tip of the pan. You definitely don't want to overproof it, otherwise your bread will deflate in the oven. Bake in your preheated 350 degree Fahrenheit oven for about 30 to 40 minutes or until the top has turned a light golden brown. Once your bread is fully baked, take it out of the oven and make sure to let it rest in the loaf pan for about 10 to 15 minutes before taking it out of the loaf pan. And that's how you make sandwich bread. Because I overproofed my dough a little bit, you can see how it deflated slightly and the top is flat rather than dome shaped, but the taste and texture of it is still fine.